Lonely rancher takes in widow and her twins, unaware they will become his family forever. That's how the story begins on a night when snow covered the road and a stranger's wagon froze at his gate. He thought he was giving shelter for one night. By dawn, her children were feeding his hens, and the sound of a hymn he hadn't heard since his wife passed was rising from the parlor. But the storm wasn't the only thing closing in. Behind her soft smile lay a paper worth more than gold, a deed some would kill to own. And when heavy boots thudded on the porch and a knock came after dark, the rancher realized he'd taken in more than a guest. He'd taken sides. The wind can strip a man to his bones out here. So can the truth. When the law comes calling, and the boy's cough turns deadly, he must decide if his life is safe or empty, or worth risking for the chance at something more. Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers, the ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. The bitter wind cut across the open range like a blade, making Eli Harper's coat flap against his legs as he guided his horse along the fence line. Winter came early to these parts, and a man had to be ready. His gloved hands gripped the reins as he checked each post, looking for any weakness that might let his cattle stray once the snow buried the markers. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground when he heard it, the distinct sound of wheels struggling in mud, followed by the nervous whinny of a troubled horse. Eli pulled up, squinting against the wind. There, near his north gate, a buckboard wagon sat tilted at an awkward angle, its wheel caught deep in a frozen rut. A sorrel horse stamped and pulled against its harness, favoring its left foreleg. Beside the wagon, a woman wrapped in a thin shawl tried to calm two children who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. The boy's harsh cough carried on the wind, while his sister, identical in age, clutched a wicker basket to her chest as if it held all their worldly possessions. Eli clicked his tongue, urging his mount forward. "You folks having trouble?" he called out, keeping his voice gentle so as not to spook the already nervous horse. The woman turned, revealing a face pale with cold and worry. Despite her worn clothes, she carried herself with dignity. "We've lost our way, I'm afraid. The storm pushed us off the main trail. Where you headed?" Eli asked, dismounting to inspect the trapped wheel. "My cousin's homestead near Silver Creek." She pulled her shawl tighter. "I'm Clara Bennett. These are my children, Will and Hannah." The boy coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that made Eli frown. The girl just stared at him with large, wary eyes above her basket. "Silver Creek's a good 20 miles north," Eli said, studying the darkening sky. "That horse won't make it tonight. Not with that leg. Storm's coming in fast, too." Clara's shoulders sagged slightly, but her voice remained steady. "We don't mean to impose. If you could just point us toward shelter. Nearest town's 15 miles back," Eli cut in. "My ranch is just over that rise." He hesitated, knowing how his next words would change everything. "You'd best come with me. Got a barn for your horse, space enough inside where you can wait out the weather." Relief flickered across Clara's face, quickly replaced by caution. "You're very kind, Mr. ... Harper, Eli Harper." He was already working to free the wheel, using his shoulder to leverage the wagon while testing the axle. No kindness in it. Just sense. Can't leave folks out here with night coming on. The wheel came free with a sucking sound, and Eli led them through his gate, the wagon creaking behind them. The sorrel limped but managed the short distance to his barn, where Eli helped unhitch the horse and showed Clara where to find hay and water. His cabin looked smaller somehow as he led them toward it, more worn. He couldn't remember the last time anyone but himself had crossed that threshold. The children stayed close to their mother, the boy trying to suppress his cough, while the girl kept one hand firmly on her basket. Inside, Eli lit the lamps and stoked the fire that had burned low during his absence. The cabin was plain but clean. A table with 4 chairs, a cookstove, shelves lined with supplies, and his bed in the corner. A ladder led to the loft where he stored feed sacks and extra blankets. "I can fix up something to eat," he offered, moving to the stove. "Got beans warming and some cornbread left from morning." "You needn't trouble yourself," Clara said. But her children's faces told a different story. Supper was a quiet affair, broken only by Will's persistent cough and the howl of wind outside. Eli noticed how Clara made sure her children ate first, taking only small portions for herself. They sat stiffly in their chairs, as if ready to flee at any moment. "We'll be on our way as soon as the road clears," Clara said firmly, helping to clear the dishes. "I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Harper." Eli just nodded, watching as she tucked her children into the blankets he brought down from the loft. He would sleep in his chair by the fire tonight, he decided, giving them what privacy he could in his one-room cabin. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Eli settled into his chair, aware of every creak and shuffle from his unexpected guests. It had been a long time since he'd shared his space with anyone. He wasn't sure he remembered how dawn crept over the Colorado mountains in shades of pewter and slate. The first hints of light found Eli, Harper already stirring in his chair by the dying embers. He blinked, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar scents filling his cabin. Fresh biscuits and coffee, smells that belonged to a different time. Clara Bennett stood at his cookstove, her movements quiet and efficient as she worked the dough. Her hair was neatly pinned back, her sleeves rolled up despite the morning chill. The children were nowhere to be seen, but the water bucket sat full by the door, drop still beating on its worn wooden sides. "Your children are up early," Eli sighed, his voice rough from sleep. Clara turned, wiping flour from her hands. "Will and Hannah thought to make themselves useful. They're out feeding your chickens." A pause. "I hope you don't mind. I found flour in your stores." Before Eli could respond, the door creaked open. Will and Hannah slipped inside, their cheeks pink from the cold. Snow dusted their shoulders, and Hannah's hands were red from the pump handle. "Chickens are fed, Ma," Will reported, trying to suppress a cough. "Got 12 eggs, too." "Much obliged," Eli managed, watching as Hannah carefully placed the eggs in a bowl. These children, strangers until yesterday, moved through his space with a quiet purpose that made his chest tight. They ate breakfast in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks and the whisper of wind outside. The biscuits were light and golden, better than anything Eli had managed in years. He found himself taking a second, then a third, while Clara pretended not to notice. After the dishes were cleared, Clara pulled on her threadbare shawl and headed to the barn. Eli watched through the window as she examined the sorrel's injured leg, her movements gentle but firm. The horse shifted nervously, but Clara spoke softly, calming it while she cleaned the swollen joint. "Your man knows her way around horses," Eli remarked to Will, who stood at the window beside him. "Pa taught her," the boy said quietly, "before the accident at the mill." Snow began falling again before midday, fat flakes that drifted past the windows like feathers. Eli pulled on his coat and headed to the barn, needing to check his feed stores. The familiar smells of hay and leather welcomed him as he counted sacks of grain and examined his winter supplies. That's when he heard it, faint but clear through the barn walls. The notes of his wife's old pump organ, silent these 10 years, drifted across the yard. The hymn was simple but sweet, played with the careful confidence of someone who knew the tune by heart. Eli found himself rooted to the spot, memories washing over him like spring floods. Sarah had loved that organ, had played hymns every evening. After supper, he'd almost forgotten the comfort of those moments until Hannah's small fingers brought them back to life. The snow continued falling through the afternoon, piling against the cabin walls. As evening approached, Clara sat at his table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The children were already asleep in the loft, their quiet breathing a counterpoint to the crackling fire. "I should tell you why we're really traveling," Clara said finally, her voice low. "My husband's cousin, James Bennett, borrowed money from us before Thomas died. Said it was for seed grain, promised to pay it back by harvest." She took a slow breath. "That was 2 years ago. The children and we need that money. I heard he has a claim near Silver Creek." Eli studied her face in the lamplight, noting the determination in her eyes. "Town ain't but 15 miles. Weather allowing, I can ride in tomorrow, ask some questions. Folk there know most everyone who staked land hereabouts." "You'd do that?" Clara's fingers tightened around her cup. "I don't want to cause trouble." "No trouble in asking," Eli assured her, though something in her tone made him wonder what she wasn't saying. "Best to know what you're riding into." Clara nodded, relief and worry warring on her face. "We'll move on as soon as the weather breaks. I won't impose on your kindness any longer than necessary." Upstairs, Will coughed in his sleep. The sound echoed in the quiet cabin, reminding Eli of the stakes involved in Clara's quest. These weren't just travelers passing through. They were a family in need, even if they were too proud to say it outright. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow continued its silent fall, covering the world in white. Tomorrow would bring what it would, but for now, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. Dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Eli Harper led his horse from the barn. The animal's breath steamed in the frigid air as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, coating everything in white, and more threatened from the heavy clouds above. Clara stood in the doorway of his cabin, pulling her shawl tight against the cold. "Be careful on the trail," she called softly, mindful of the sleeping children. "The snow makes everything look different." "Done this ride more times than I can count," Eli assured her, though the weather did concern him. "Keep the fire going." There's split wood stacked against the north wall. He mounted up, the leather creaking beneath him. Through the cabin's window, he could see Will and Hannah bundled in quilts near the stove, their small forms still curved in sleep. Clara had already stoked the fire. Smoke curled from the chimney into the gray morning sky. The first mile passed easily enough, but then the snow began to spit from the clouds, sharp, stinging flakes that bit at his face. Eli pulled his collar higher and urged his horse forward. The usual 2-hour ride stretched longer as fresh powder obscured the trail markers he typically relied on. By the time he reached town, the church bell was striking noon. Main Street was quiet, with only a few hardy souls hurrying between buildings. Eli tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and stamped the snow from his boots before entering. Sheriff Carter looked up from his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. "Eli Harper, ain't often we see you in town this time of year. Need some information, Amos." Eli settled his hat on his knee. "About a man named James Bennett." The sheriff's expression darkened. He removed his glasses, folding them carefully. "Now there's a name I didn't expect to hear today. What's your interest?" "His cousin's widow showed up at my place, looking for him. Says he owes her money." "Clara Bennett?" The sheriff stood abruptly, moving to close the office door. "She's at your ranch?" Something in Carter's tone made Eli's stomach tighten. "Her and her 2 young ones. Got caught in the storm. Lord have mercy." Carter pulled a thick file from his desk drawer. "James Bennett's been running a land fraud scheme across 3 counties. Selling claims he don't own, forging documents, taking money from settlers." He spread several papers across his desk. "And look here. Clara Bennett's name appears on some of these papers as a witness to transactions." Eli leaned forward, studying the flowing signature. "She said she hadn't seen him in 2 years. Likely didn't know what she was signing." Carter shook his head. "But that won't matter to some folks. 3 families lost everything they had to. That scheme. They're out for blood, and they ain't particular about whose blood it is. She's got 2 children, Eli protested. Then keep her away from town, Carter advised grimly. Until we catch James and sort this mess out, her name's mud around here. Could be dangerous for her. Eli's jaw tightened. Where is James Bennett? Now, last seen heading toward Denver. I'll wire the county seat. Got a deputy there keeping watch. Carter paused. Eli, you're a good man, but be careful getting mixed up in this. At the telegraph office, Ellie paid for a message to his old trail partner, now working as a deputy in Denver. The operator promised to send any reply to the ranch once it arrived. The ride home was grueling. Snow fell heavily now, and darkness came. Early, his horse plowed through drifts, guided more by instinct than sight. It was well past supper time when he finally saw lamplight glowing from his cabin windows. Clara met him at the door, worry clear on her face. I was about to send Will to the barn to look for you. The cabin was warm, filled with the smell of beans and cornbread. The children sat at the table, waiting. Will's cough seemed worse, echoing in the small space. Eli shed his snow-covered coat and sat heavily in his chair. Clara served him a plate, but he barely tasted the food. Her question hung in the air until the children were settled in the loft. What did you learn? She asked finally, her voice low. Eli stared into his coffee cup. Your cousin's got a bad name in these parts. Best not to go looking for him. Clara's hands twisted in her apron. There's more. I can see it in your face. Her eyes met his, steady and determined. What aren't you telling me, Mr. Harper? The fire popped in the silence between them. Outside, the wind moaned around the cabin corners, and snow continued to fall in the darkness. That morning brought no relief from winter's grip. The wind howled through the valley like a living thing, rattling the cabin's windows and throwing snow against the walls in bitter gusts. Eli stood at the window, watching white sheets dance across the frozen ground. No one would be traveling today. The path to town had disappeared entirely under fresh drifts. Inside, the cabin held onto its warmth. Clara sat in the old wooden rocker by the hearth, her nimble fingers working at a pile of worn socks. The quiet click of her darning needle matched rhythm with the crackling fire. Will and Hannah played a quiet game of cat's cradle with a length of string in the corner, their whispers barely audible above the storm. Eli pulled on his heavy coat. Best split some more kindling while we can still open the door. Outside, each swing of the axe brought sharp satisfaction. The dry wood split clean, and Eli's breath clouded in the frigid air. Through the window, he caught glimpses of Clara, moving about the cabin stirring the stew pot, showing Hannah how to fold clean linens. The sight stirred something in his chest that he wasn't ready to name. When he carried the kindling inside, savory steam from Clara's cooking filled the air. She'd stretched yesterday's rabbit with extra potatoes and carrots, making the meat go further. The children set the table without being asked, and soon they were all seated around the steaming bowls. Eli cleared his throat. Mrs. Bennett, there's something we need to discuss. Clara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. The sheriff told you something yesterday, didn't he? Something more than just James having a bad name. Will Hannah, Eli said gently. Why don't you two go up to the loft for a spell? Once the children's footsteps had faded above, Eli told her everything, the land fraud scheme, the forged documents bearing her signature, the angry settlers looking for someone to blame. Clara's face grew paler with each word, but she didn't interrupt. I never knew, she whispered when he finished. James asked me to witness some papers 2 years ago, said they were for buying grazing rights. I trusted him because he was family. Her hands trembled slightly. Those poor settlers. Sheriff Carter reckons you signed without knowing what they really were, Eli said. I believe that too. Clara's eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. Thank you. Not everyone would. After dinner, Eli pulled on his coat again. Need to check the storage shed, take stock of what we have. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he made his way to the shed. Inside, he counted sacks of flour and beans, dried meat, and preserved vegetables. With careful rationing, they could stretch it through the worst of winter, but it would be lean times. He'd have to dig out the root cellar tomorrow if the wind died down. When he returned, the cabin had transformed. Clara sat at his wife's old pump organ, her fingers moving carefully across the yellowed keys. The children's voices rose sweet and clear on a familiar hymn, Amazing Grace. The music filled every corner of the small space. Pushing back against the howling storm outside, Eli stood in the doorway, snow melting from his boots. His late wife, Sarah, used to play that same hymn on Sunday evenings. He hadn't heard it since. She passed, hadn't wanted to. But now, watching Clara teach Will and Hannah the verses, the memory brought more comfort than pain that something warm and dangerous unfurled in his chest, something that had nothing to do with pity for their situation. He tamped it down hard. Clara needed his help, nothing more. Come spring, she'd move on, find a new place for herself and the children. The evening wrapped around them like a quilt, soft and peaceful despite the raging storm. Clara put the children to bed, then returned to bank the fire for the night. Her face glowed in the fading light as she turned to him. Mr. Harper, she said softly, I want you to know how grateful we are. Not just for the shelter and food, but for believing in me when you had every reason not to. Eli shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct thanks. He touched the brim of his hat in silent acknowledgement, then retreated to the spare room where his bedroll waited. The space was cold, far from the dying fire, but he'd known worse discomfort. Still, as he lay in the darkness listening to the wind, he couldn't quite shake the memory of Clara's fingers on the organ keys, or the way her voice had blended with her children's in that old familiar hymn. It had made his lonely cabin feel like something he'd almost forgotten a home. The snow eased its relentless assault 2 days later, leaving the valley wrapped in a hushed blanket of white. Eli pulled his coat tight and trudged through knee-deep drifts toward the barn, eager to check on the animals after being cooped up for so long. Warm animal breath and the sweet scent of hay greeted him as he shouldered open the heavy door. Clara's. Sorrel Mari nickered softly from her stall, and Eli grabbed his medical kit to check her injured leg. The swelling had gone down some, but the horse still favored it heavily as he worked. His hand brushed something solid beneath a folded saddle blanket on the stall divider. A small tin box, about the size of a Bible, sat partially concealed in the rough wool. Eli straightened, knowing he shouldn't pry but concerned about what secrets his guests might be harboring. The crunch of boots in snow announced Clara's approach before she appeared in the doorway. Will balanced on her hip despite his size. The boy's face was flushed from the cold, his persistent cough muffled in his mother's shawl. The box is mine, Mr. Harper, Clara said quietly, setting Will down on a hay bale. Just some personal items I couldn't bear to leave behind. Eli nodded, continuing to wrap the horse's leg. Didn't mean to snoop, ma'am. Just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything that might bring trouble to my door. Clara's shoulders tensed, then relaxed. She crossed to the stall and retrieved the box, running her fingers over its dented surface. No trouble, I promise. Though She hesitated, then opened the lid. There is something you might help me understand. From beneath a few letters and a tarnished locket, she withdrew a folded document. The paper was crisp despite its obvious age, official-looking script visible through the back. It's a land claim deed, she explained, carefully unfolding it. My husband left it when he passed. Near the new railroad spur, if I read it right. I thought perhaps I could sell it, start fresh somewhere, but I've never had anyone knowledgeable. Look it over. Eli wiped his hands on a rag and accepted the document. His eyes narrowed as he studied the careful handwriting, the official seals. The tract described lay just where the railroad company was buying up land for their expansion prime territory that could fetch a handsome price if the deed was genuine. Mind if I look closer in better light? He asked. Clara nodded, and they made their way back to the cabin. Hannah had soup warming on the stove, and Will settled into his usual chair by the fire, still fighting his cough. Eli spread the deed on the table, comparing the markings to what he remembered from his own land purchase years ago. "Far as I can tell, looks authentic," he said finally. "But Mrs. Bennett, you should know land claims near the railroad, they attract attention. Not always the good kind. Men get greedy when there's money to be made." Clara's face tightened. "I feared as much. That's why I've kept it hidden, never tried to sell. But with the children." She glanced at Will, whose cough seemed worse in the dry winter air. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm foolish not to try." "I could help," Eli offered, surprising himself. "Know some honest men in the land office. Could get it verified proper, maybe even find a fair buyer." "You'd do that?" Clara's voice held equal measures hope and wariness. "Least I can do, given everything." Eli carefully refolded the deed. "But we'll need to be careful. Word gets out about this could bring the wrong sort of attention." Clara tucked the document back into its tin home. "Thank you, Mr. Harper, truly." The afternoon sun was already sinking when Eli remembered they needed water. He hitched his draft horse to the small sled they used for hauling the heavy barrels. Clara insisted on helping, and Will begged to ride along, his eyes bright despite his pallor. They made slow progress through the snow to the creek. Will perched on the sled wrapped in blankets. The creek ran swift enough under the ice that they could break through to fill the barrels. Working together, Eli and Clara managed the task quickly, though he noticed how she favored her right arm after lifting the third barrel. That night, long after everyone had retired, Eli lay awake in his cold room. The deed weighed heavy on his mind. If genuine, it could mean security for Clara and her children. But he'd seen what happened when valuable land came into play, how quickly greed could turn neighbor against neighbor, how desperately some men would fight to claim what they thought should be theirs. The wind whispered around the cabin's corners, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Eli stared into the darkness, calculating risks and possibilities, knowing that helping Clara verify the deed might protect her, or expose her to dangers greater than the winter storm that had brought her to his door. The morning frost painted delicate patterns on Eli's window panes as he prepared for another ride into town. He'd wrapped Clara's deed carefully in oilcloth before securing it in his leather saddlebags, double-checking the brass buckles. The document felt like both promise and peril, weighing heavy on his mind as he saddled his bay G-E-L-I-N-G. Clara stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight. "Be careful, Mr. Harper." He touched the brim of his hat, noting how the early light caught the silver threading through her dark hair. "Always am, ma'am." The ride into town took longer than usual, with patches of ice hiding beneath the fresh snow. Eli kept one hand near his saddlebags, watching the horizon with sharper eyes than normal. By mid-morning, the town's sparse collection of buildings came into view through the winter haze. Peterson's general store stood at the heart of town, its pot-bellied stove drawing the usual crowd of morning gossips. Eli tied his horse at the rail and stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. He needed supplies anyway, might as well hear what news was floating around. The bell above the door announced his entrance, but few heads turned. Near the stove, 3 men huddled in conversation, their voices low but intense. Eli pretended interest in a shelf of canned goods, keeping his ears open. Railroad single quotes S offering top dollar now, one man muttered. But Jensen wouldn't sell. Next thing, some tough fellows show up, start making threats about water rights. Heard they ran the widow Miller clean off her place, another added. Said they had papers proving prior claim. Mighty convenient timing, if you ask me. Eli's hand tightened on the can he held. He'd known Martha Miller 20 years, no way. She'd give up her land without cause. Old Peterson shuffled over, his shrewd eyes studying Eli. Need something particular today, Harper? Actually, Eli set the can down carefully. Been meaning to ask about survey records for the new railroad. Spur. Trying to sort out some boundary questions. The storekeeper's bushy eyebrows lifted. Boundary questions, eh? Lot of those going around lately. He glanced toward the men by the stove. County clerk might help you better than I can. Eli gathered his supplies quickly, paying with coins that felt warm in his palm. The conversation by the stove had shifted to weather predictions, but he felt eyes following him as he left. The clerk's office occupied a narrow building next to the sheriff's. Inside, dust motes danced in shaft of pale sunlight while Eli waited for the clerk to examine Clara's deed. Everything appears in order, the clerk said finally, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Proper seals, correct survey numbers. But with all the claims and counterclaims lately, you'd need Judge Morrison's confirmation to make it truly solid. He won't be through until spring circuit. Eli nodded, tucking the deed back into its oilcloth wrapper. Much obliged. The ride home felt longer, though the sun still rode high. About 3 miles out, movement caught his eye riders on the ridge to the north, maybe 3 of them. They sat motionless, watching. When Eli turned his horse slightly their direction, they melted back over the ridge like shadows at sunset. His mood was dark as storm clouds when he finally reached the ranch. The sight of smoke rising straight and steady from his chimney eased some tension from his shoulders. But not all. Inside, Clara sat in the pool of afternoon light by the window, showing Hannah how to piece together patchwork squares. Will lay on his stomach nearby, carefully threading needles for them. The scene struck Eli as both foreign and familiar, like something from that other life, before loss had emptied his home of such gentle moments. Clara looked up, her fingers stilling on the fabric. You're troubled. Eli hung his coat by the door, buying time to order his thoughts. Deed's genuine enough. Clerk confirmed it, but double quote. But her voice was soft, yet steady. He settled into his chair by the fire, watching Will industriously sorting through scraps of calico. Railroads buying up land along that spur line, paying good money too. But seems some folks aren't interested in selling, and there's been pressure, strong-arm tactics. Clara's hands tightened on her sewing. What kind of pressure? Threats about water rights. Suspicious papers appearing, challenging legitimate claims. Eli leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. You'll need to be careful, Mrs. Bennett. That deed of yours, it could be worth a fair piece of money to the right buyer. But it could also bring the wrong kind of attention. Hannah looked up from her careful stitching, glancing between them. Clara smoothed her daughter's hair with a gentle hand. I understand, she said quietly. We'll be cautious. Though it seems we've already found some protection, thanks to your kindness. Eli shifted, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice. Just doing what's right. Even so. Clara returned to her sewing, but her movements were slower now, thoughtful. Even so. January settled over the Colorado highlands like a wool blanket, wrapping Eli's ranch in pristine white silence. The shortened days fell into a gentle rhythm, as natural as breathing. Each morning, Clara rose before dawn to kindle the fire, while Eli trudged through knee-deep snow to tend the livestock. The children's laughter echoed through the cabin as they helped with morning chores, their small boots leaving tracks alongside the adults' larger ones. The evening hours grew precious, filled with the warm glow of kerosene lamps and the comfort of familiar voices. After supper, Eli would settle into his chair by the hearth, his old leather Bible creased and soft from years of handling. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapped in quilts, while Clara mended by lamplight. His deep voice filled the cabin as he read stories of faith and perseverance. Reckon that's enough for tonight, Eli would say, marking his place with a faded ribbon. One evening, as Hannah helped clear the supper dishes, she turned to Eli with shining eyes. "Pa, could you tell us about when you first came to Colorado?" The words slipped out natural as breathing, but it stopped everyone cold. Hannah's face flushed pink as she realized what she'd said. "I mean, Mr. Harper." Clara's hands stilled on the dish rag, and Will looked up from his slate where he'd been practicing his numbers. The silence stretched thin as spider silk until Eli cleared his throat. "No harm done," he said softly, though his heart hammered strangely in his chest. "And yes, I reckon I could tell that tale." The kitchen table became a schoolroom during the day, with Clara teaching from the few books they had. She wrote arithmetic problems on the children's slates and listened as they recited their letters. Sometimes Eli would pause in his work, drawn by their voices through the window. More than once, he found himself stepping inside, boots carefully wiped clean, to show them practical ways to use their figures. "Now see here," he'd say, sketching in the dust on Will's slate. "If we're putting up new fence, and each post needs to be 10 feet apart, how many posts would we need for 300 feet of fence line?" Will's forehead wrinkled in concentration as he worked through the problem while Hannah counted on her fingers. Clara watched them all with a quiet smile that warmed the room better than any fire. When Sunday came, they hitched the wagon and rode together to the little white church that served the scattered ranches and homesteads. The morning air rang with hymns, and Eli found himself singing more often than not, especially when Hannah's clear voice rose beside him. They sat together in the back pew, a picture of propriety, though Eli noticed the sideways glances and whispered conversations. After services one bitter cold Sunday, Clara insisted on stopping at the Mercantile for thread and sugar. Eli minded the children in the wagon while she went inside. When she returned, her face was pale as the snow, and her hands trembled as she climbed up to the seat. They were halfway home before she spoke. "They're saying things in town." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "About me, about us." Eli's jaw tightened. "What kind of things?" That my husband's cousin's crimes are mine too. That I'm trying to trap you, take advantage." She twisted her hands in her lap. "That you've taken up with a swindler's widow." The wagon creaked through the snow as Eli considered his words carefully. "Folks will talk. It's the way of small towns. But we know the truth of things, do we?" Clara's voice caught. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm bringing trouble to your door, Eli. You've been so kind, but these rumors, ... Mrs. Bennett," Eli interrupted gently. "Clara, you and those children are no trouble. Don't let idle gossip shake your faith in that." In the back of the wagon, Hannah and Will had fallen asleep, bundled together under thick blankets. Clara watched them for a long moment, then squared her shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." But that evening, after the children were abed, Eli caught Clara standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. The worry hadn't left her eyes, and he recognized the weight settling on her shoulders. It was the same one he carried, the knowledge that their comfortable arrangement walked a razor's edge between propriety and scandal, between safety and risk. He wanted to tell her that the gossips could go hang, that her presence had brought life back to his empty house, that Hannah's slip of calling him Pa had stirred something he thought long dead. But the words stuck in his throat, too big and too dangerous to voice. Instead, he simply nodded when she bid him good night, watching as she disappeared into the room she shared with the children. The lamp burned low as Eli sat alone by the fire, his Bible open but unread in his lap. Outside, the January wind whispered secrets to the stars, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the endless snow. A week of uneasy peace settled over the ranch like fresh snow. The days stretched long and cold, filled with routine tasks that kept idle hands busy and worried minds occupied. But as dusk gathered on a bitter Thursday evening, 3 sharp knocks shattered their quiet supper. Eli rose from the table, his hand brushing the rifle mounted above the door. Clara gathered the children closer, her face tight with concern. The knock came again, more insistent. When Eli opened the door, 3 men shouldered their way inside without waiting for invitation. Snow fell from their heavy coats onto the plank floor. The largest man, wearing a railroad company foreman's badge, removed his hat to reveal steel-gray hair and hard eyes. "Evening," the foreman said, his gaze sweeping the cabin before settling. "On Clara, Mrs. Bennett, I presume?" Clara stood, keeping the children behind her. "I am. Name's Matthews, railroad business." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Seems you're in possession of a deed we've got questions about." Eli moved to stand between the uninvited guests and his family. The word came naturally to his mind now, family, though he pushed the thought aside. "If you've got business here, you can state it properly through the law." The 2 deputies exchanged glances. One thumbed his gun belt meaningfully. Matthews smiled without warmth. "That deed your widow friend's holding. It's forged, plain and simple. We're here to collect it before things get complicated. You have proof of that claim?" Eli's voice was quiet but firm. "Hand it over now," Matthews said, ignoring Eli's question, "and we can all forget this unfortunate business." Clara's voice rang out clear and steady. "That deed was my husband's legacy to his children. It's perfectly legal, as your own county clerk confirmed to Mr. Harper just last week." Matthews took a step forward, but Eli didn't budge. The cabin grew so quiet they could hear the wind whistling through the eaves. "Mrs. Bennett," Matthews said, his tone dropping dangerously low, "I'm trying to be reasonable. That land's marked for the railroad one way or another. Might be a shame if trouble found its way to this nice little arrangement you've got here." A sudden harsh cough broke the tension. Will doubled over, his whole body shaking with the force of it. Hannah wrapped her arms around her brother, eyes wide with fear. Matthews backed toward the door, settling his hat back on his head. "Think on it, Mrs. Bennett. We'll be back, and next time we won't be asking so nice." He fixed Eli with a cold stare. "Keep that in mind, Harper." The door slammed behind them. Outside, horses snorted and hooves crunched in the snow as the men rode away. But no one moved until Will's coughing fit subsided into weak, rattling breaths. Clara rushed to her son, pressing her hand to his forehead. "He's burning up," she whispered, fear threading through her voice. Eli helped carry Will to the bedroom, while Clara heated water and gathered what medicines they had. The boy's cough grew worse as the night wore on, each breath a struggle that tore at everyone's hearts. Hannah refused to leave her brother's side, holding his hand and singing softly the hymn she'd learned on the pump organ. Clara sat beside the bed, wiping Will's brow with cool claws, her lips moving in silent prayer. Every hour, the cough seemed to sink deeper into his chest, and his fever climbed higher. Eli brought fresh water, extra blankets, anything that might help, but he felt helpless against the illness taking hold. Near midnight, Will's breathing became so labored that Clara looked up at Eli with tears in her eyes. "He needs a doctor," she said. "He's never been this bad before." Eli nodded, already reaching for his coat. "I'll ride for Doc Turner at first. Light. He's half a day's ride, but I'll make it faster." The hours until dawn crawled by with agonizing slowness. Will tossed in fever dreams, calling out for his mother. Clara never left his side, her voice hoarse from soothing him, her hands gentle but trembling with exhaustion. As the first pale light crept over the mountains, Eli saddled his fastest horse. The temperature had dropped further in the night, and his breath frosted in the air as he checked his gear one final time. Clara met him at the barn door, wrapped in her shawl. "Be careful," she said softly. "Those men might still be watching the trails." "I'll bring help," Eli promised. He hesitated, then added, "Keep the rifle close, just in case. Hannah knows where I store extra shells." Clara nodded, her face drawn with worry. "God speed you safely." Eli swung into the saddle, his heart heavy. With more than just concern for Will, the boy's labored breathing, the railroad men's threats, Clara's quiet strength, it all twisted together in his chest like a rope pulled too tight. As he urged his horse through the deep snow, he sent up silent prayers for Will's survival and for whatever strength they'd need to face what was coming. The sun rose blood red over the white plains as Eli pushed his mount harder, racing against time and winter and fear itself. Dr. Turner arrived just past noon, his medical bag crusted with snow from the hard ride. Eli helped the weathered physician dismount, noting how the older man's joints creaked from the cold journey. Inside the cabin, Will's coughing echoed against the walls, each sound like a hammer struck to their hearts. The doctor's examination was thorough but gentle. He listened to Will's chest with his stethoscope, checked his throat, and measured his fever while Clara hovered nearby, her hands clasped tight. Hannah sat in the corner, unusually still, watching every movement with wide eyes. "Pneumonia," Dr. Turner announced finally, his voice grave. The cold air and that persistent cough have settled deep in his lungs. He reached into his bag, pulling out several glass bottles. "This syrup is for the cough, 1 spoonful every 4 hours. These powders go in hot water for the fever. Keep him warm, but not too hot. Plenty of fluids, broth is best if he'll take it." Clara nodded at each instruction, memorizing every detail. The doctor demonstrated how to prop Will up with pillows to ease his breathing, showing them the right angle. "The position is crucial," he explained. "Helps clear the lungs." "How long until he improves?" Eli asked, watching Will's labored breathing. "Hard to say. Next 2 days are critical. If the fever breaks." The doctor paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, we'll hope for the best. I'll try to return tomorrow to check on him." But as Dr. Turner prepared to leave, heavy snow began falling again. The wind picked up, driving white sheets across the windows. "Storm's coming in fast," Eli observed, his jaw tight. "Might be safer if you head back now, Doc." The physician agreed reluctantly, leaving them with final instructions and promises to return when weather permitted. Eli watched him ride, away until the swirling snow swallowed both horse and rider. The afternoon stretched into evening like cold molasses. Clara refused to leave Will's bedside, spooning broth between his cracked lips whenever he stirred. She bathed his hot forehead with cool cloths, murmuring prayers and comfort with equal measure. Eli kept the fire blazing, adding logs every hour until the woodbox ran low. The sound of his axe rang out across the yard as he split more, the physical labor helping him work out his helplessness. The ranch felt different now. Every creak of the cabin's timbers seemed louder, every whistle of wind more mournful. The usual evening routines fell away, replaced by the rhythm of Will's struggling breaths and Clara's soft voice reading from the Bible. When he was conscious enough to listen, Hannah helped where she could, fetching fresh water and clean cloths. But as night fell, exhaustion overtook her, and Eli carried her to the spare room. When he returned, he found Clara still at her post, though her shoulders sagged with weariness. "Try to rest," he urged quietly. "I'll watch him for a spell." She shook her head. "I can't leave him. What if ... Her voice caught, and suddenly the careful composure she'd maintained all day crumbled like dry earth. "I can't lose him, Eli," she whispered, tears finally breaking free. "After James died, the children were all that kept me going. If we'll ... She pressed her hands to her face, shoulders shaking. "I can't be alone again. I'm not strong enough." Eli moved without thinking, taking her trembling hands in his weathered ones. Her fingers were cold, despite the cabin's warmth. "Listen to me, Clara Bennett," he said, his voice low and firm. "You are not alone, not anymore." She looked up at him. tears still tracking down her pale cheeks. "I give you my word," he continued, meaning each word more than any promise he'd ever made. "No harm will come to you or these children while I draw breath. Not from sickness, not from those railroad men, not from anything this hard country throws at us." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "You can't promise that," she whispered. "You can't control everything." "No," he agreed. "But I can promise to stand beside you through whatever comes. That's not nothing." Will coughed then, a wet, rattling sound that made them both turn. Clara reached for the cough syrup with one hand, but kept hold of Eli's with the other. Together, they helped the boy sit up enough to take the medicine. When Will settled back, his breathing slightly easier, Clara didn't let go of Eli's hand. They sat in the lamplight, watching over the sick child, their joined hands a silent testimony to promises made and kept. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. The fear remained, but it was no longer quite so sharp, no longer quite so lonely. They would face whatever came, illness, threats, uncertainty, together. Will's breathing eased slightly as the pale winter sun rose on the third morning of his illness. His fever had dropped enough that he could take small sips of broth without coughing. Clara's eyes shone with tears of relief as she felt his forehead, finding it cooler than the night before. Eli watched from the doorway, his decision already made. The snow had let up just enough, and he couldn't wait any longer. The railroad men would return, perhaps with more than threats next time. He pulled on his heaviest coat and began gathering supplies in the pre-dawn darkness. Clara found him in the barn, securing his saddlebags. "You can't mean to ride out in this weather," she said, pulling her shawl tighter against the bitter cold. "The drifts must be shoulder-high in the passes." "Which is exactly why I need to go now," Eli replied, checking his horse's girth strap. "Those railroad men won't expect anyone to attempt the ride to the county seat. Judge Watson will be there through the month. If I can get your deed properly registered and your name cleared." He paused, testing a stirrup. "Well, it needs doing, that's all. But it's dangerous," Clara protested. "The temperature's still falling. If something happened to you out there, .. She stepped closer, laying a hand on his arm. "We need you here." "Liz." Heart twisted at her touch, but he kept his voice steady. "What we need is to settle this proper and legal, so you and the children can rest easy." He reached into his coat, showing her where he'd tucked the deed and supporting papers safely against his chest. "I aim to have the judge's seal on these by tomorrow night." Clara's eyes filled with worry, but she nodded slowly. She understood. Necessity. It was written in every line of her face, in every careful stitch she'd ever sewn to keep her family together. "At least take more supplies," she said, turning to gather extra bags of dried beef and hard biscuits. The sky was still dark when Eli mounted up, though a faint gray line along the eastern horizon promised dawn. Clara stood in the doorway, Will's blanket-wrapped form visible behind her. "God keep you safe," she whispered as Eli touched his hat brim in farewell. The first hour wasn't too bad. Eli knew his own land, even in deep snow, but as he pushed higher into the hills, the wind grew fierce, driving ice crystals that stung like needles against any exposed skin. His horse plowed through drifts that reached past its chest, snorting with effort. Eli kept one hand near his face, trying to shield his eyes from the worst of the blowing snow. By midday, the temperature had dropped further. Eli's beard was frozen solid, and his toes had lost all feeling despite his thick wool socks. He dismounted several times to walk beside his horse, both to warm himself and to give the animal rest from carrying his weight through the deep snow. The county seat was normally a day's ride in good weather. In these conditions, he'd be lucky to make it. By the following afternoon, the wind howled across the open country, drowning out all other sounds. Eli thought of Clara and the children, warm in the cabin, and pressed on. Each step was a battle against nature itself, but he'd fought worse odds before. The deed papers crinkled against his chest with every movement, reminding him of his purpose. Near dusk, with his horse showing signs of dangerous fatigue, Eli spotted the welcome shape of a line shack through the swirling snow. He'd used it before during cattle drives, a simple one-room shelter with a small stove and space to get out of the weather. Getting the door open took all his remaining strength, his fingers clumsy with cold dot inside. He found dry kindling and a few pieces of split wood, trail courtesy from the last visitor. His hands shook as he struck a match, but soon had a small fire going in the stove. After settling his horse in the lean-to outside, Eli filled a pot with snow to melt for drinking water. As feeling painfully returned to his extremities, Eli checked the precious papers. They were still dry, protected by his layers of clothing. He smoothed them carefully on the shack's rough table, reading through them one more time by the light of a stub candle he'd found on a shelf. The night pressed in around the little shelter, wind moaning through every crack. Eli added wood to the stove, then knelt beside his saddle for evening prayers. He prayed for Will's continued recovery, for Clara's peace of mind, for safe passage through whatever tomorrow might bring. Most of all, he prayed for the strength to make things right for the family that had somehow become more precious to him than his own life. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the need to tend the fire and check on his horse. But even in the depths of the bitter night, Eli felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove's heat. He was doing what needed doing, for Clara, for the children, for the future he dared to hope might still be possible. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds as Eli urged his weary horse down the last slope into the county seat. Frost coated his beard, and every breath sent daggers of pain through his chest. His fingers, despite the thick gloves, had lost most feeling during the brutal night ride. The courthouse stood like a weathered sentinel at the end of the town's main street. Eli dismounted stiffly, his legs nearly buckling as they touched the ground. He led his horse to the livery first, ensuring the faithful animal would have warm shelter and feed before seeing to his own needs. Inside the courthouse, warmth from the pot-bellied stove hit him like a physical wave. Eli stamped snow from his boots and removed his ice-crusted hat, waiting for sensation to return to his face. The clerk looked up from his desk, eyebrows rising at Eli's frostbitten appearance. "Need to see Judge Watson," Eli managed through chattering teeth. "Matter of property rights." The clerk disappeared through a heavy oak door, returning moments later. "Judge'll see you now. Says you look half frozen to death." Judge Watson's chamber was small but well heated. The judge himself, a stout man with iron-gray hair and keen eyes, gestured Eli toward the chair before his desk. "Quite a ride you must have had, Mr. Harper, Your Honor, Eli Harper." His trembling hands retrieved the deed and supporting documents from inside his coat. "Come about this land claim. Belongs to a widow woman, Clara Bennett. Railroad men been causing trouble, claiming it's worthless paper." The judge examined the documents carefully while Eli gradually thawed. The deed's precise lettering and official seals stood out clearly on the yellowed paper. "This appears properly executed," Judge Watson said finally. "But given the current disputes with the railroad, we'll need additional testimony to verify its provenance." "Already seen to that, Your Honor." Eli pulled out a folded telegram. "Asked White Feather to come. He was there when the original grant was made, part of the treaty settlement back in '63. The judge's eyebrows rose. "White Feather? The Apache elder?" At Eli's nod, he continued, "That's fortunate. He's respected by both sides. When can he arrive?" "Should be here by noon, weather permitting." Then staying with his grandson near Pine Creek. They didn't have long to wait. Just past 12 o'clock, the courthouse door opened to admit a tall, dignified Apache elder. Despite his advanced years, White Feather moved with fluid grace, his dark eyes sharp and alert beneath silver hair. He greeted the judge with a slight bow, then turned to Eli with a hint of a smile. "The storm spirits tested your courage, friend," he said quietly. "Few would ride in such weather for another's cause." The judge called the hearing to order, recording White Feather's sworn testimony in his formal ledger. The elder's account was clear and detailed. He had indeed witnessed the original land grant, part of a complex agreement that had helped maintain peace during troubled times. His precise memory of the circumstances, participants, and even the weather that day left no room for doubt. "The paper speaks true," White Feather concluded. "The land was given fairly, in accordance with both white man's law and the old ways. The widow Bennett holds it by right." Judge Watson's pen scratched across official documents for several minutes. Finally he looked up, satisfaction evident in his face. "The deed is hereby confirmed valid and binding. I'm issuing an order requiring the railroad to negotiate fairly if they wish to purchase the property. Any further harassment will be dealt with severely." He fixed Eli with a stern look. "Make sure Mrs. Bennett understands she's under the court's protection now." Eli's exhaustion lifted slightly at these words. He gripped the judge's hand in thanks, then turned to White Feather. "Much obliged for your help. Couldn't have done this without you." The elder clasped his arm briefly. "Truth needs no thanks. Go safely, friend. The storm is not finished with its dance." At the telegraph office, Eli carefully counted out coins for a message to Clara. "Deed confirmed, stop court, orders railroad to deal fairly, stop. Starting home soon, stop." Eli, the operator, warned him fresh snow was moving in fast. Eli knew he should wait, but the thought of Clara and the children waiting for news pushed him toward the livery. He'd rest his horse a few hours, then start back. The same determination that had gotten him here would see him home. As he checked his saddle straps, Eli reflected on how much had changed since that bitter evening when he'd first spotted Clara's stuck wagon. The lonely rhythms of his solitary life had been broken by something warmer, something that filled the empty spaces of his heart like spring water filling a dry creek bed. Now, with Clara's name cleared and her future secured, perhaps there was hope for more than just helping neighbors in need. White Feather had been right. The storm wasn't done. Heavy snow was already falling as Eli led his horse out of the livery stable. But home lay ahead, and this time he rode toward something, not just away from the cold. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard when Eli's horse finally trudged through the gate. Clara rushed onto the porch, her shawl billowing in the wind, tears freezing on her cheeks as she watched him dismount. 2 days of worry had left dark circles under her eyes, but her smile lit up her entire face. "Thank the Lord you're safe," she whispered as he climbed the steps, his joints stiff from the cold ride. "We've been praying every hour." Inside the warm cabin, Will sat propped up in a chair near the fire, wrapped in quilts. His cough had eased, though his face remained pale. Hannah knelt beside him, reading from one of Eli's old books. "Mr. Harper," Will's voice was weak but eager, "did you really see a real judge?" Eli hung his coat by the door and settled into his chair with a grateful sigh. Clara brought him a steaming cup of coffee, then sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The judge confirmed everything," Eli explained, watching relief wash over Clara's face. "The deed's valid, and the railroad's been ordered to negotiate fair and square if they want the land. Could fetch enough money to set you up proper somewhere." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. "I can't believe it's really over. No more running, no more looking over my shoulder." As the evening wore on, the warmth of the fire and the quiet comfort of being home again worked their magic. Will and Hannah dozed off in their chairs, faces peaceful in the firelight. Eli stood carefully, lifting Hannah first and carrying her to the small bedroom. He returned for Will, tucking the boy in beside his sister with gentle hands that had known nothing but ranch work for so many years. A week passed swiftly, marked by Will's strengthening health and Hannah's daily piano practice. The morning sun streamed through frost-coated windows when a polished buggy pulled up to the ranch house. Clara's hands trembled as she smoothed her apron, but Eli's steady presence beside her calmed her nerves. This time, the railroad agent, a different man, wearing a proper business suit, removed his hat respectfully at the door. He spread documents across the kitchen table, explaining terms in plain language. A 20-year lease with fair yearly payments, Clara retaining full ownership of the land. "Take your time to consider it," the agent said, but Clara's eyes had already met Eli's. He nodded slightly, having reviewed similar contracts during his younger days working cattle drives. "I accept," Clara said firmly, her voice clear and confident. The agent smiled, offered his pen, and soon the papers were signed and witness to mark the occasion. Clara invited the pastor and his wife for Sunday dinner. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of roasting chicken, while Hannah proudly showed off her new patchwork squares. "Will, now strong enough to sit at table properly," said Grace with a clear voice that brought tears to his mother's eyes. My, Pastor Roberts remarked, glancing around the living room where the children's books and Clara's mending basket had found their places. "This house feels properly filled again, Eli. The Lord works in mysterious ways." Clara ducked her head, a blush coloring her cheeks as she served the tender meat and garden vegetables she'd preserved last fall. Eli simply nodded, but the gentle way he passed the biscuits to Hannah spoke volumes about how much had changed since that stormy night, when 3 travelers had appeared at his gate. The March wind whispered gentle promises through the grass, as Eli led Clara along the familiar trail to the ridge. Winter's grip had loosened its hold on the land, leaving behind patches of early wildflowers dotting the awakening earth. They walked in comfortable silence, their boots crunching on the last patches of melting snow from the top of the ridge. The entire ranch spread out below them, the weathered barn, the sturdy house, the corrals where Will had begun helping with the horses now that his strength had returned. The afternoon sun caught the windows, making them gleam like gold. Eli cleared his throat, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "these past months, you and the children, well, you've brought life back to this place, back to me." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not one for fancy words, but I'd be honored if you'd stay, not as my guest, but as my wife." Clara's eyes welled with tears, catching the sunlight. "Yes," she whispered, then stronger, "Yes, Eli Harper." They returned to the house hand in hand, where Will and Hannah waited on the porch. The children must have read the answer in their mother's shining eyes, for they launched themselves at Eli with joyful shouts. He caught them both, his arms strong and sure, while Clara watched with her heart full to bursting. That evening, the lamp in the window cast its warm glow across the yard, 4 shadows moving in familiar harmony within. Eli sat in his chair, watching his family gathered around the hearth. Will reading his primer, Hannah humming a hymn, Clara sewing by lamplight. He offered up a silent prayer of gratitude, knowing that God had sent him not just temporary boarders to shelter, but the family he never thought he'd have again. "Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart."